Order, order. I call Tony Antonianza to move the debate.
I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 653593 related to assisted dying. And it is an honour to serve under your chairship, Sir Robert. It's no secret that I grew up as a Catholic and attended Catholic schools. And one of the most engaging lessons was religious education, where topics like abortion and assisted dying, or euthanasia, as you may wish to call it, were hotly debated. And I've also admired my teachers who, with firmly held views, always encouraged debate. Well, at least that's how I remember it anyway. And I've taken and continue to take this attitude in my work as a Member of Parliament. For this place to have integrity, Sir Robert, we must agree disagreeably and have the skills to debate and amend legislation which we may or may not agree with. And assisted dying is one such debate. There's no set definition for what assisted dying is, so from the outset I want to clarify that here we are referring to the involvement of healthcare professionals in the provision of lethal drugs intended to end a patient's life at their voluntary request, subject to eligibility criteria and safeguards. It includes healthcare professionals prescribing lethal drugs for the patient to self-administer and healthcare professionals administering lethal drugs. Now, Sir Robert, this petition calls for the Government to allocate parliamentary time for assisted dying to be debated in the House of Commons and to give members of this House a vote on the issue. Over 207,000 people have signed the petition so far, 272 are from my constituency of Gower, and the petition remains open, so the numbers are probably ticking over as we speak. The petition was started by Hannah Geisler, the health editor at the Daily Express, and is supported by Dame Esther Ranson, who is named in the petition. Hannah and the Daily Express have been campaigning on this issue for around 2 years. However, Dame Esther's public comments marked a change in public perception on assisted dying, leading them to launch this petition, and I pay tribute to their dedication and tenacity. People across the House will know this is not the first time I have opened a debate on this topic on behalf of the Petitions Committee. In July 2022, this House considered e-petition 604383, which asks to legalise assisted dying for terminally ill, mentally competent adults. And that petition had over 155,000 signatures. The fact that in less than 2 years we have had two petitions debates on this subject clearly indicates to me and to others that this issue is one our constituents are highly engaged in. And I have no doubt that Dame Esther Ranson has contributed to a heightened awareness of assisted dying. By her own admission, in our discussion, she didn't realise that speaking out about her personal choice would have had the impact that it has. Whatever our own views, we must recognise that public opinion on assisted dying has shifted in one direction. Polls by Dignity in Dying have shown overwhelming support for law changes with safeguards in place. Membership of Dignitas held by UK citizens has raised to 1,900, with a 23% rise during 2023. In preparation for both this debate and the previous, I've met with a wide range of voices around assisted dying. Prior to this debate, as well as speaking with Hannah and Dame Esther, I spoke with Dr Matthew Dorry, the Honorary Secretary for Association of Palliative Medicine of Great Britain and Ireland, Dr Andrew Green, the Deputy Chair of the British Medical Association's Medical Ethics Committee, and Jonathan Blay from the Royal College of General Practitioners. These conversations are always welcome and really challenge my stance in this debate. The more evidence and sunlight that we can bring to these debates, the better, and we must never dismiss concerns, but consider them fully. I will.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, because is the truth of the matter not this, that the debate will continue whether we have it here or not? My colleague, Ian MacArthur, has a bill going through the Scottish Parliament at the moment. Similar legislation has been considered in the Isle of Man and in the Channel Islands. This is something which is going to have to be addressed, and we do it in our own time, with our own measured, reasoned debate, or else we risk having decisions made for us.
I fully accept the point he's making, that the law is changing in other places and in other countries and parts of the UK. And that's important to consider, and to consider what is done well and not is done not so well. And that is for us in this place to consider fully when the opportunity arises. But choice is a key word for Dame Esther and for many of those that have signed this petition, having the choice to die under their own conditions with dignity and without struggle.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I shall.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend for giving way on that point. She's making an excellent speech. I was here for the last debate she had, and I'm pleased to see it overwhelmingly supported today. The fact of the matter is that you can have a good death if you can afford or are physically able to fly to Switzerland. That is something that is grossly unfair and is completely out of reach for the vast majority of my constituents in Pontypridd and the vast majority of people in the United Kingdom. So it is absolutely right that we have that debate, because if you can afford and if you're physically able to do so, you can have a good death.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, particularly because she raises a very valid point about the cost of this option for those that can afford to travel and the discrepancy that there is in our healthcare system. I shall.
That was a perfectly valid intervention. Surely one way to approach this problem is that we should get much better palliative care throughout the country, and that everybody should be entitled to a dignified death. And on this point, under the law of double effect, it is perfectly proper for a qualified doctor to relieve pain with very large amounts of morphine, as long as his or her primary purpose is not to kill the patient.
I really value that contribution, because that contribution means that palliative care, two-thirds of which in the United Kingdom, two-thirds of palliative care is actually funded by charities. It's a postcode lottery, and excellent palliative care is what I would hope to have, but have the choice to assisted dying and palliative care. And I'll go on to discuss that further in my debate. I will, but I am very aware of the time and the contributions that are needed to be made.
I'll be very brief, and I'm grateful to her for giving way, but would she agree with me that actually assisted dying can be a catalyst for more resources to go into palliative care? That's exactly what we've seen in many administrations around the world.
Yes, and I thank her for her intervention, and I think that is a valid point that she makes. But it's how your family remember you and those last dying hours with them that is also what worries people like Esther Anson. It is the struggle that so often sticks in the minds of families when they lose a loved one. And one thing that we can agree on is that this choice must be the choice of the individual, and also one that is well informed. Now, Sir Robert, there are always intended and unintended consequences to any legislation, and it would be perhaps naive to suggest that any change in the law would not have wider consequences in society beyond the individual making a choice. Safeguarding is a huge issue amongst the voices who oppose a change in the law. In 2023, we saw the Danish Ethics Council concluding that the existence of an offer of assisted dying will decisively change ideas about old age, quality of life and dying, and that there is too great a risk that it would become an expectation aimed at certain groups in society. How do we prevent vulnerable people from coercion at a time when they are afraid and ill? And that's about conversations. It's about decision-making.
I'm so grateful to the Honourable Lady, for whom I have the highest regard. Can she explain one thing to me? I do understand the idea of safeguards against coercion. Where I have a problem with this notion of assisted suicide is, how do you have a safeguard against the person themselves feeling that they have to accept that they're going to die by their own request rather than be a burden to others? You can protect them from the pressure of others. You can't protect them for the pressures they will put on themselves, even though they don't really want to die.
And I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention there, because those are exactly the conversations that we need to be having, and seeing how this has worked in other countries, and seeing who, looking at data, being specific and taking our role as legislators seriously. We may fall on a different side of the debate. However, it is about considering and arguing, and very much, again, the work that has been done in this House, in the Health and Social Care Committee, also reflects that, that importance of having the debate and taking the evidence. And I hope that that would come out if we get to debate this on the floor of the House. The Association for Palliative Medicine of Great Britain and Ireland and the Royal College of General Practitioners oppose any law changes, whilst the BMA holds a neutral stance. And I thought that was very interesting. I was very interested to see what the BMA had suggested, and unfortunately I don't have time to go into that now. But, everyone I spoke to agreed that no medical professional should be forced to assist patients to end their life. However, that their stance was a very interesting one that we should consider.
My friend give way.
Okay, right.
I'm grateful to her. She's making an excellent speech. She's pointed out the opinion polls and the international comparison: Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. The list goes on. But on the neutral stance she mentioned of the BMA, does she not agree with me? Some of us are actually massively conflicted on this. I'm very pro-choice when it comes to abortion. But last time I actively abstained, voted yes and no. I was relieved the status quo was upheld. Does she not agree with me? Some of us are relieved there is no vote today, because with the Hippocratic Oath and other things, we're just massively torn on this one, despite the opinion polls.
Well, yes, and I appreciate a contribution, but I'm going to make progress, because I said I was only going to speak for 10 minutes. And she makes a very valid point, which will now be noted, and I thank her for it. This is not an easy debate to have. But in their written responses to the petition, the government has said it remains the government's view that any change to the law in this sensitive area is a matter for Parliament to decide. And if the will of Parliament is that the law on assisted suicide should change, the government would not stand in its way, but would seek to ensure that the law could be enforced in the way that Parliament intended. And whilst there has not been a vote in Parliament since 2015, this doesn't mean that this House is ignoring the issue, because in February this year, the Health and Social Care Select Committee, as I've mentioned, published its report on assisted dying. The report didn't make any recommendations on law changes, but rather the aim was for the report to serve as a basis for discussion and further debate in Parliament. A common theme from the evidence submitted to the committee's inquiry was that many respondents called and wanted to talk about was a good death. I want to make it abundantly clear, Sir Robert, that assisted dying should not be discussed as a replacement to palliative care. We must also have frank discussions about how palliative care can be improved, and so we can give people the most comfortable end of life as possible. Last Monday, there was an engaging backbench debate in the House on the funding for hospices. And in the interest of time, I recommend that members and other interested people read the topic in Hansard. We have to think about some of the recommendations that the whole Health and Social Care Select Committee did make around palliative care. And it recommended that the government ensures universal coverage of palliative care and end-of-life services, gives an uplift to funding to hospices that require assistance, and commissions research in how to better provide mental health support and guidance after a terminal diagnosis, and establish a national strategy for death literacy and support following a terminal diagnosis. And that was a point raised by Dr. Dorey during our conversation. And it struck my mind about funding, because, as I've already mentioned, about 2/3 of the funding for palliative care comes from charitable organisations, and I really don't see how that is good enough. Should the law change on assisted dying and any services be covered by state funding, what message would this be sending? There are important questions to consider should a vote in Parliament rule in favour of a law change, some of which I hope I've highlighted this evening. These questions are difficult, but as legislators, it's our job to assess the evidence to try and answer them. The topic of assisted dying is so broad, there are many areas I simply do not have time to cover. such as the current situation in the Crown jurisdictions, the pursuits of prosecutions of family members, or the many individual stories I've heard. I have previously spoken about the death of my father over 12 years ago, but my family have been supporting my lovely mum, who's had a very tough year. And since December, there has been a few times when we didn't expect it to pull through. Many friends and colleagues in this house have offered prayers, and I have to say my mother is our little Easter miracle. The Catholicness never leaves you, and she continues to make good progress. However, over this time, I have personally wanted to talk about death and consider how I want my death to be. The experience of being in a hospital where there is death all around you makes you reflect. It seems harsh and even simplistic, Sir Robert, that when such emotion and heartbreak is all around you, you want your loved ones to be out of pain, however that looks. We've been lucky that my mother has got better, whilst her life has changed greatly. And my own personal view is that if you do have a terminal diagnosis and are mentally sound, shouldn't you have the choice to take yourself out of suffering? And that is the choice that Dame Esther Ransom talks about. So whatever comes from today's debate, I'd like everyone to consider bringing up the subject of their death with their loved ones now, not before it's too late. Because there are two things, Sir Robert, that are certain in this world. We are born and then we die. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 653593 relating to assisted dying. As members may have noticed, this is a popular debate, so please try and keep to 3 minutes or below. Normally, you would be expected to be nailed to your seats till the wind-ups, but if somebody were to vacate their seat to do other business, the chair will be pragmatic. Peter Bodley.
Thank the Honourable Lady for her introduction of this debate. Frank Field, when he spoke in one of the first major debates on euthanasia, told the story of how Barbara Wootton, the person who founded the National Assistance Scheme, made him promise that were she in hospital with a terminal condition, he would empty her medicine cabinet, bring all the things which together would be a poison, so she could end her own life. She lived perfectly conscious in hospital for 6 months and never did that. Frank Field, on the 22nd of October 2021, was reported as saying that he'd just come out of a hospice, he'd now changed his mind. In the past, he was against euthanasia, assisted dying, medical assistance in death, however one wants to call it. He made his speech about changing his mind 2.5 years ago. And when I've seen him over the last months, he hasn't raised this issue at all. So I think people can understand that people's views aren't always as intense as they sometimes appear. And as a great fan of Dame Esther and someone who collaborated with her, or she manipulated me when I was a minister, put it that way, in 1986, when we were campaigning for a really good thing on child restraints in cars. Were she to be put in the case for better hospice care, she'd do it with the same verve as hearing her speak on the broadcasters in the last few days. I'd like to go on a debate with her if she were willing. And I would say how many people they think would qualify under the kinds of terms which are suggested in this petition. We have about 5,000 to 6,000 suicides a year in this country. Do people think we're talking about 100 people a year extra or 1,000? I put it to the people who are here, that if we had a Dutch level of medical assistance in death, we would add 15,000 deaths a year. We would treble the number of existing suicides and take them up with the existing ones to 4 times. People talk about the safeguards and conditions. There's a list of all the conditions and safeguards that other countries are taking away. So it starts with the people who can't afford to go to Dignitas, say, and it then expands to those who are depressed. Every MP and their staff know what it's like trying to help somebody who rings up all right and says, I'm going to do away with myself because of the condition I'm in or how I feel. We don't say, we're in the Westminster Hall having a debate making it easier for you to carry that out. We say, Can we talk for a time? Can we pass you on to somebody else you can talk with? Is there help which might make your life different and changed? I'm at the sort of age where I'm an orphan. My parents have died. My father died aged 93, and when he came out of hospital after being rather badly shot up in the war, didn't spend another night in hospital in his life. He knew he was dying. He'd stopped eating. He stopped drinking. And a few hours before he died, he came out of subconsciousness, and he said, "Am I still alive?" He was told, "Yes." He said, "I'm so sorry," and went back to sleep, and then died. My mother died 3 days after a diagnosis. She'd had the benefit of a wrong diagnosis 6 months before, so she lived her last 6 months happy, rather than being mucked about in hospital. And when she was told she'd be dead within 3 days, she said, "Can we talk about the funeral?" And my father said to my wife, "Look, Virginia, you're the health secretary, you're rather busy. Which day is convenient for you?" In front of my mother, and perfect normal conversation. And conversations about death, I think, are ones we ought to be having. And I could conclude, Sir Robert, by telling the story of a member of my family who died last week, and the hour-by-hour reports of those who were sitting with her, both in the care home who had a hospice end-of-life service, and of those in my family, would make a lot of people think twice before charging down a route which could lead to increased number of suicides in this country by 3 times.
Thank you, Sir Robert, and it's a pleasure serving you as Chair. And thanks also to the Petitions Committee for enabling us to have this debate today. I want to begin by saying quite openly that after a great deal of thought, I've come to the same conclusion as that in the petition, namely that the time has come when we should legislate to enable, with proper safeguards, assisted dying to take place. I don't want to get into the detail of what such a bill might look like. I think that is for another day and another debate. What I want to do today, however, is to address the principle, and to do so by referring to 2 arguments that are commonly used to oppose such legislation. The first being issues of faith, and the second being issues that have already been referred to about pressure being put onto people to make a decision that they might not, when the time comes, want to happen. So I'll start with the issue of faith, and I must be clear, Sir Robert, I enter into that with a great deal of trepidation, and I certainly don't want to get caught up in any tangled theological debates. But as a Christian myself, I think there are 2 principles involved that are important. The first one is the argument that we are all given free will, particularly those of us who are brought up in one of the Abrahamic faiths, that we're given the free will. Our life isn't mapped out before us, but we have the free will to make choices at certain times in our lives. The second is that the God I was brought up to respect as a Christian, I can't imagine it would be a God who would want people to die in pain and suffering in a way, that frankly is, I think, unchristian. The second argument is the one that's already been referred to, namely that people will be put under pressure to take a decision at some point along the road to the end of their life, which they either don't really want or they don't, at the time, when the time comes, want to be exercised. Now, I've thought a great deal about this, and it seems to me that that view is based on an unduly pessimistic view about human nature. The view that people will carry out that wish or pressure their close relative or loved one to take that decision purely on the grounds that it might serve them well financially, in other words, a venal motivation, or that they might want to elude the responsibility or avoid the responsibility of having caring responsibilities in the later stages of their loved one's life. I don't believe that is how people, the majority of people, take those decisions. There will be some people, I concede, Sir Robert, who might act in that way, but I think the overwhelming majority of people will act as they act, out of love, rather than out of self-serving motives. And it comes back also to the exercise of free will. So I think, as I said at the outset, that the time has come for us to make a decision about this. I'm not being prescriptive about the clause-by-clause nature of what a bill should do, because, as I said, this isn't the occasion to do that. A second reading of a bill would be the appropriate occasion. But I would conclude by saying to the Minister, I think I would like to, or at least I'd like to think, not least because I won't be here after the next election, that we will have the opportunity before this Parliament concludes, as a Parliament, to be able to vote on a piece of legislation on this that would take us forward before the next general election. I don't expect her to give me any assurances on that today, but I hope, as a member of the government, she will use such influence as she has to bring that about.
I'd just remind members about the 3 minutes, please. Select Committee Chairman Steve Bryan.
Thank you, Sir Robert. Thank you, John. The assisted dying assisted suicide report, which you referenced, the Health Select Committee, which I chair, it's tagged to this debate. We published it on the 29th of February. All members of the House received a copy of it from me. We received, complete coincidence, the government's response to the report just this morning. Honourable members can find that on the committee's website now. Our report is a pretty big piece of work. It includes roundtables from people who've got lived experience. We talked to health and care workers from across the NHS and social care, including people who on a daily basis actually provide care to people at the end of their lives. We went on a number of visits, including to Oregon, the US, where it's been legal for over 20 years, and to the Royal Trinity Hospice in Clapham. We received just shy of 68,000 responses to our online form, which is the largest number of responses of this type to any engagement from a House of Commons committee. We held 5 evidence sessions with witnesses from across the world, and we received close to 500 written evidence submissions. As we set out to conduct the inquiry, we were very clear that we didn't want to weigh in on whether assisted dying should be legalised or whether the law should remain unchanged. This, Sir Robert, seems to have disappointed just about everybody, which tells me that we got it just about right. And more importantly, in line with the terms of reference which we published at the very start, which just produced that weighty reference for MPs and peers to draw from in the future. Our aspiration was that Parliament would have a broad and well-researched basis for further consideration, whether that be sooner or later. Now, obviously, today's debate makes it sooner, but I predict it will come back again, and we can be crystal clear that this is a general debate today, not a piece of draft legislation. And I would just implore the campaign groups that encourage people to contact their MPs about this debate to just be clear and be accurate about what this is, because it isn't fair to mislead people as to what we're doing today. This is a general debate. Now, the government made it clear in their response to us this morning, including evidence to us that they gave, that it will not bring forward legislation in this area. More a possible change in the law would be sought through a private member's bill, and indeed that's what's happened in other jurisdictions where this has become the law. It was very interesting in our report to look at the international jurisdictions, although I'd say the evidence is quite limited in terms of track record on this, because in the majority of jurisdictions that have this law, it is actually quite recent. In Oregon, which we visited, as I've said, they've had legislation for 2 decades. Now, their legislation comes in to the category where a person having an established terminal diagnosis means they were likely to die within a prescribed period of time, passing away within 6 months. In the Netherlands, however, the legislation applies to a much wider set of criteria, where the person seeking to access it can do so on the basis of unbearable suffering, quote, end quote, subjective to their own experience. And this is the point, as just made by the previous speaker. I take the rather old-fashioned view that MPs should vote to change the law based on a clear and concise understanding of what exactly it is we're changing it to. That is not the purpose of today. Just finally to say, we didn't find any evidence to suggest that the provision of palliative and end-of-life care had deteriorated in quality of provision following the introduction of assisted dying in those jurisdictions. Actually, some evidence suggested there's been an increase in the funding of palliative care services. So I think that is interesting. And I hope that colleagues will follow up the point that some have made, and in the opening speeches, is that there will be probably legislative changes elsewhere in the UK, certainly in the Crown dependencies in the coming months. The ministers do need to be ready to respond to that, whatever their intention for the law in England. So there is no time, as ever, to set out too much in these debates of 3 or so minutes. But I hope that colleagues will reference our report, and I look forward for the time that I can be here today to listen to contributions and the Minister at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Robert. It's a pleasure for an honourable friend to chair of the Select Committee, having also travelled with the evidence over the last 18 months and really engaged with everything which people have written to, sharing those opinions and life experiences. And I really do commend the report to the House. We learnt especially the need for having a better death, and there are lots of opportunities for that, improvement in palliative care, and listening to the clinicians about the extent by which that can be brought. But also hearing very clearly that if the law were to change, it would also fundamentally change the relationship between the physician and the patient, and that is a consideration the House must take. Not only should there be more investment in palliative care, but also pushing on the opportunity for more research in that area. And of course, addressing many of those social factors which are cited as to why people want to access palliative care. Often it's around poor death literacy, and certainly I'm disappointed that the government have not got a plan to improve that, and urge them to consider that. But also to look at those reasons why people have opted in other jurisdictions for end of life as set out in the petition. The loss of being able to have meaningful activity, loss of dignity, loss of activities of daily living and incontinence. For many people, perhaps people with an impairment, this is their daily experience. And yet to say that dehumanises an individual would be wrong. We should move on from the embarrassment and the inconvenience and look at how quality of life can be given to everyone, no matter their impairment. Loneliness and isolation also being cited, but that is a societal failure which must be addressed. And if we improved our NHS care, our social care and civil society, many of those reasons will be dismissed. And it is not lost on me why we are debating when the NHS is in such tatters, when social care is in a dire condition, and where civil society has had so much funding withdrawn, that we're actually debating this motion today. There is much for government to do, and it must address those reasons in order to ensure that everyone has those opportunities for a good end-of-life experience. But I'm worried about the person who says, I'm just getting in the way. My children themselves will have a better future without me. Perhaps those savings I have put aside could be better spent by them than on me. It isn't necessary coercion, but the way that people feel in a society that changes the law. We have much to address in the physical, psychological and spiritual needs of people in our country, and that must be our first consideration.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not a religious man, but I've always viewed life as sacred. And so for most of my life, I have been disinclined to accept the arguments of people who are in favour of assisted dying. But various events have changed my view in the last several years. Some time ago, a long time ago, my mother died of cancer, brain and lung cancer, in considerable agony, in considerable pain, and I suspect terror too. And I am pretty sure that the doctors in charge of her accelerated her demise. I'm glad they did. It was a miserable, miserable time for her, and for her to go more peacefully with an excess of morphine, if you want to put it that way, was, in my view, a good thing. And I suspect it was the norm, the unstated norm in those days, that this was done. Doctors took those decisions quite properly themselves. But I also suspect that that changed after the Shipman scandal, when Dr. Shipman killed hundreds of people, and doctors then became rather fearful of the legal consequences of doing what I have just described. That, in my view, alters the balance of this argument. Later on, Bishop Bill Westwood, some may remember him, probably the only Thatcherite bishop in history, became a constituent of mine. And he also argued with me that we should change the law to allow assisted dying. And I was surprised at that because of his faith. You know, I thought that was really quite material. And then, only a few months ago, one of my constituents talked to me about her father. Her father had motor neurone disease, and he was terrified of getting to the end of his life and being unable to do anything about it. And so he told her that he intended to end his life earlier than the inevitable outcome. Now, he was a very wealthy man, and he was able to afford a private jet to fly himself and his whole family to Dignitas in Switzerland and go through the process there to deliver what my constituent described as a beautiful death. Certainly a painless death. And I've come to the conclusion that as long as extremely strict controls are put in place so that no one feels pressurized to end their life, I am supportive of the legalization of assisted dying. But be clear, we must not make the same mistakes other countries have made. I'm thinking here particularly Canada and the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, for example, several people with autism and intellectual disabilities have brought the end of their life on, some of them before the age of 30. That's not, in my view, acceptable. Similar weaknesses apply in Canada. So we must ensure that safeguards are in place. And given the time, Mr. Chairman, I will just finish with this comment. There have been references at the moment to a private member's bill. That is the wrong mechanism for this. This requires a multi-day second reading to take it through. It requires a many multi-day report stage to take it through to get it right. Because once we get it right, unless you're going to accept this as a slippery slope that we're stepping on, we've got to make it the final decision at the point we do it as a parliament. And so I'm a friend of 50 years of Frank Field. We were close friends and allies in all sorts of things over that time. And he, like me, opposed this proposal for a long time and changed his mind at the end. And I'm honoured to follow him on that course.
Paul Bonfield. Or Paul Bonfield, sorry, united.
The year after my father took his life alone and prematurely with terminal lung cancer. But I think today's debate is different because I believe that we are finally now on the brink of catching up with public opinion and of bringing about law change, not in this Parliament, but in the next. Since 2015, over a dozen jurisdictions around the world have introduced laws enabling choice at the end of life. Today, over 30, covering hundreds of millions of people, offer that choice with protections. In the UK, the medical profession has dropped its opposition. Legislators in Scotland and Jersey and the Isle of Man are crafting laws that will give choice and protection. The Leader of the Opposition has committed to ensuring parliamentary time for proper consideration of a bill in the next Parliament, and that commitment has been echoed by the Prime Minister. So law change will be debated soon, and we have the opportunity today to inform that debate to some degree, and that's what the Health Select Committee report did, and I was pleased to be part of that report and want to confine my remarks to that because our report starts by looking at the impact of the current law. So many of the 68,000 submissions that we received set out powerfully how the current law is failing people, forcing loved ones with a terminal diagnosis to plan their deaths secretly and to take their lives alone and often violently. Now, I do, Sir Robert, understand why debate focuses on the consequences of change. But the evidence that we heard underlines the consequences of leaving the law unchanged. It forces those who wish not to end their lives, but to shorten their deaths, to act while they have the capacity, and too many die too soon. Our report drew heavily on the practical experience of jurisdictions which have legalised assisted dying, and they took two routes, one based on terminal illness, the other adding wider criteria like intolerable suffering. My remarks are based on those opting for terminal illness alone because it's the approach of most countries, it's the approach of previous legislation proposed here, and it's the approach I'm sure will be proposed in the next Parliament. We listened hard to the concerns of those opposing law change, and they fell into three areas, but our evidence provided reassurance on all three. We found not a single jurisdiction that had opted for assisted dying for terminal illness had extended it beyond that definition. There is no slippery slope. We found no evidence of coercion in jurisdictions allowing assisted dying. It's not to say that coercion may not exist, but assisted dying laws seek to provide protection in contrast with our current law. How do we know that the 650 people taking their own lives now were not coerced or didn't take that decision because they felt themselves to be a burden? We talk rightly about safety in this debate, but it's the current law that's unsafe, and assisted dying laws are safer than blanket bans.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts. And I think it is right that Parliament looks at this issue early in the next Parliament, whether to leave things as they are or to make change. There is clearly public pressure for us to do so. I was not able to get to the deaths of either of my parents. They both died in hospital before I was able to get there. But I was very involved in the death of my mother-in-law just over 2 years ago. I was privileged to help with my wife and her two brothers and my 3 children to help look after her in her final weeks. And my biggest observation from the privilege of looking after her in her dying days was that pain relief was much too slow to get hold of. I spent many Saturday mornings driving round North Yorkshire to get to a GP surgery to ask for her morphine prescription to be increased. And that is simply not good enough in this country today. The thing about pain relief is you have to get ahead of the curve. It's no good delivering it after the pain has built up. And that is something we urgently need to look to. I have a constituent, I will very briefly.
Morphine and access to it. For some people, it is just simply not an option. There is allergies to opiates, which is, whilst uncommon, in existence for many patients who are going through end-of-life care. Does he share my concerns about that and that should be included in this debate?
I wasn't aware of that, and I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for putting it on the record. I have a constituent who wrote to me on Saturday about her sister, who she described as begging to put herself out of her misery before she died, and that death actually led to the nephew of my constituent also taking his own life because he was so shocked by the death of his mother. And none of us would want that to happen. But I have to say, I have been deeply, deeply shocked by the remarks of the journalist Matthew Paris, who said in an article recently that he welcomes this being the thin end of the wedge, that he makes no apology for treating human beings as units, and he says that we should be making the cold calculus of inputs and outputs. And I am appalled by that, and I hope that every member here is appalled by that type of discussion about our frail, elderly fellow citizens who have a right to dignity and care right to the end of their lives. So I will certainly fight back against that, and I call out what he said today in this debate. I also think we need to look at the quality of life for people in their final days. I was sat next to one of my constituents this morning who talked about how bored his 92-year-old father is in his dying days. And that, I think, is an issue for us as well. Life should be full of stimulation. Life should provide things for people to live for. And we need to make sure that our elderly and those towards the end of their lives are not bored and are not lacking in stimulation such that they think that they have nothing to live for. So I welcome the fact that Parliament will look at this issue. We have the commitment from the Prime Minister, we have the commitment from the Leader of the Opposition. There's definitely work to do on pain relief. It's not where it should be. But I do perhaps want to end by the quote of Cicely Saunders, who founded the hospice movement, who said, "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life, and we will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to help you live until you die."
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Sir, for your chairship, and to my honourable friend, the member for Gower, for leading this really important debate. And I'm very pleased to be able to speak again on this issue, calling for parliamentary time for assisted dying to be fully debated and for MPs to have a vote on this issue. The blanket ban on assisted dying and refusing terminally ill people the autonomy to make decisions at the end of their lives forces them to suffer against their will while loved ones watch on helplessly. Some choose to avoid this fate and seek assisted death abroad, but this comes at a substantial cost. Currently some £15,000 to travel to Switzerland for this purpose. And this highlights systemic inequality where only those with financial means have access to choice over the timing and manner of their death. And for the terminally ill, this should be a right, not a privilege. This inequality forces many people who don't have other options to take their own lives. Each year, up to 650 terminally ill individuals end their lives, with many more attempting to do so, often in secret and using unsafe methods at home. So the lack of safeguards, regulation and oversight forces dying individuals to take matters into their own hands without adequate support for themselves or their families. And as a humanist, I believe in individuals' rights to make informed choices about their own care and quality of life, and that people are not forced into making horrible, lonely decisions to end their own lives, something which the blanket ban on assisted dying in this country fails to recognise. The legalisation of assisted dying for terminally ill, mentally competent adults with robust safeguards must be introduced to promote freedom of choice at the end of life. And I reiterate that is about choice, because they similarly agree there needs to be better pain management and much more support for palliative care, but this is also about choice if you wish to choose it. People deserve autonomy and compassion in end-of-life decisions, and the public agree. Unwavering public support for assisted dying is exemplified by the 200,000 plus signatures on the petition calling for the parliamentary vote on this critical issue, and the fact that reform is backed by the majority in every parliamentary constituency across Great Britain and over 60% of my constituents in Luton South. I was encouraged to hear that the Leader of the Opposition has pledged to allow time for the next Parliament to consider assisted dying if Labour were to form a government, and the public is counting on us as their elected representatives to ensure their right to freedom of choice at the end of life, as this is fundamentally an issue of dignity and compassion. We must use our power to alleviate the pain of thousands of suffering individuals and their families by ensuring a free vote in Parliament on assisted dying.
I feel a heaviness of heart about this debate, in part for my faith, but also just the weight of seriousness on this issue to ensure that I'm representing the constituents who have contacted me in droves about this matter. And I think there hasn't been a surgery for some time when somebody hasn't come in and a public Q&A, a gentleman broke down in tears, thinking about the death of his wife. A lady very carefully walked me through her experience of the death of her sister, culminating in a trip to Dignitas, and describing the place and has never left me. And I have to say that steadily over a period of many years being the Member of Parliament for Stroud, constituents' experiences have changed my views, and arguments about choice compassion, the ability to plan is very, very powerful to me. Although my constituents know I'm very careful in how I vote, and I would need to see legislation in front of me before making a final decision. And constituents have also contacted me on the opposite side of the debate in a very powerful and thoughtful way. I actually refer to the article of Josh Glancy in the Sunday Times this weekend that sets out a number of the arguments that my constituents have also raised. I thought I would also use my brief time just to give you an example of the very thoughtful correspondence I've had. A gentleman wrote to me, his wife is alive. He said, "This is extremely personal to me and my wife, who has an incurable blood cancer at the age of 55. Neither of us want her to suffer the gradual progression through incapacity, pain and death without her being able to choose her time of death with dignity, whereas at present the only choice might be to travel abroad and seek an exit prematurely." Another gentleman went on, and a very thoughtful and long correspondence where he talked passionately about his mother, working-class Liverpool woman, went on to become the curator at the historic Royal Palaces. I like the fact that he said, "You would have absolutely loved her, Siobhan." But he said that the weeks through her illness was actually rather life-affirming. His mum considered taking her own life, as her best friend had actually done through a terminal diagnosis, but she didn't, and she told us that she was glad that she hadn't, because she would have missed out on the experience of so much love and goodwill from family and carers. Yet she also went on to plead for death in the final weeks. It took 16 weeks for her to die effectively from starvation. And I mention this gentleman because he said that when my mum was dying, and this is hard, isn't it? We all get these. I promised myself that I, at the very least, would write a letter, and I'd write this letter to my MP, so that the bitter disagreement with the law and my experience would be on record and known. And thank you for taking the time for it. We've had these emails. I agree with the Honourable Member for Holton and Hazel, sorry, I'm going to get his constituent wrong, but we have to have days on this. This is not a quick, this has to be very thought through and a big debate with everybody involved. So thank you.
Just to throw a Hansard to my speeches in the 3 previous debates and then sit down, which might have been popular. But looking at those debates, I realised that this is a subject to which some urgency now attaches. The last one was less than 2 years ago. The previous one, again in this chamber, 3 years before that, and 4 years before that, we had the last vote in 2015, when I was in the position of my neighbour for Brentford Isleworth replying for the opposition. I think I'm right in saying that the previous vote was about 18 years before that. This is a matter which I think, partly due to public opinion, demands our attention. And I hope and trust that perhaps certainly after an election, we may be in the position to legislate on this matter as soon as a year's time, but with the caveat that that will have to be a very serious and profound process of legislation. Because public opinion is leading us on this. It doesn't mean that we have to follow public opinion, but there is a substantial change in the mood of the public and an overwhelming support for some form of assisted dying, whereas I don't think the arguments and the opinions have greatly moved on over those last 10 years, certainly. For me, this is one very simple question. At the end of my life, that it is not just my choice, but my right to decide the manner and timing of my leaving it. And I hope, therefore, that the firstly, for a huge improvement in palliative care. I took part in the debate in the main chamber on hospice care last week, and I pointed out that we have not had inpatient beds that are most convenient for my constituents for 6 years, for lack of a constituent. And that shouldn't be happening anywhere in the country. But in reality, I don't believe anybody would say that their religion or their personal views should impact on my choice. The one issue that is there undue pressure? undue pressure by the state, undue pressure by the family, undue pressure by the person themselves considering that act. I don't believe we have many laws for dealing with coercive behaviour. We should have better palliative care. We should, as a society, be able to reassure people that they are all valued as long as they want to be with us, even at the end of life and even perhaps in great pain and suffering. That should not be a barrier to those who wish to leave because of great pain, because of great suffering, because the end of their life is near, in taking that decision. And I think, as a society, we have to grasp that very difficult decision and move on.
Malthouse.
Chairman, I'm grateful to you. I am chair of your party group, or co-chair of your party group on choice at the end of life, so it should come as no surprise that I support the aspiration of the decision. And over the last 10 years of my involvement in the campaign in Parliament, I've become used to converts, very welcomed converts to the cause. But of course, they almost always convert to the cause after they have been through the horrible experience of watching someone they love go through an awful, agonising and degrading death. And so when Esther Rantzen stepped forward and talked about the impact that her disease was having on her and her decisions into the future, it should come as no surprise that there was an outpouring of support from the British people, because, of course, for many people, she was part of the family. She appeared in their front rooms on a Saturday afternoon on a regular basis with her smiley, sunny demeanour. And so when she is facing a horrible death and with money decides to take the choice, and the fact that she is supporting the campaign for a change in the law, the British people obviously stood up and listened. And they listened to the extent that they now don't really understand, or don't really, understand why politicians tolerate or talk about three particular things. First of all, they do not understand how so many people in this House can stand for the status quo, when, as members have already stated in the room, the status quo is appalling. We have hundreds of people taking their own lives in this country, thousands dying agonizing, horrible deaths, who may wish to do something different. And, of course, we've got business class. So it's even worse. If you've got the money, you can have what the law denies to everybody else. It's an outrage, and it should change. Worse than that, we've already heard from members here today that many members who would oppose me making the choice are quite happy for a doctor to do it for me. They're quite happy for a doctor just to give a bit extra squeeze on the morphine and take away my own agency and my own choice and my own rights about my life. And they just don't understand how so many people can tolerate that. Second, they don't understand this view of the country that it's teeming with granny killers, all of us waiting just to bump off wealthy relatives so we can pocket the cash, like we're some kind of nation of Geoffrey Bambers, intent on remunerating ourselves. They don't understand that the vast majority of the British people, they love their parents, they love their grandparents, they want the best of them, they agonise when they die. Go to the funerals, see them greeting each other at airport terminals, you'll see the love there. Now, that's not to say there shouldn't be safeguards, but we have safeguards in lots of other areas, and we should in this too. And then thirdly, they don't understand how people of a genuine religious faith can seek to impose their own morality on the rest of us. They haven't done so on gay marriage, they didn't do so on homosexuality, on adultery, abortion, sex before marriage. Why on this should the British people be denied a choice? Because of the certainly, legitimately held religious conviction of others. If the law changes, as I hope it will, and assisted dying becomes available to me in extremis and to others, people need to realise that it is not compulsory. You may not want it for yourself, you may not want it for your relatives, but please don't stop me having it. Thank you.
Sir Robert, I was thinking today about all those evenings being allowed to sit with my parents and watch That's Life, and how I could never have envisaged this moment. But of all the campaigns, the successful campaigns that Dame Esther Rantzen has been involved in that astonishing career, there can surely be none which has touched a nerve with the British public and so widespread as this one. Her involvement with this petition which in my constituency alone 555 people have signed, for me shows that there is a momentum amongst the British public, a desire to see a national debate on the subject. and for their Parliament to reflect their view, which we see in so many opinion polls nowadays. It's not a party political issue, but for the record, my party, which believes in the freedom, dignity and well-being of individuals, has long supported the idea of a free vote in Parliament and would welcome a vote in the next Parliament, a free vote for us all to make the choice. And I find myself in a strange position where my colleague Liam MacArthur is currently steering a private member's bill on this issue through the Scottish Parliament. And if he's successful, I would hypothetically have a choice denied to so many other people in this room, a significant choice. But there is also another bill going through the Scottish Parliament about to be introduced by a Scottish MSP, a Conservative MSP, about improving palliative care. And Liam and Miles Briggs are working together because the two are not mutually exclusive. We should not see it as a choice between assisted dying or palliative care for us, but for the individuals affected. They should have the choice. And I think the time has come when we need to recognise that there is a momentum. Other parts of the UK are going to make decisions on this shortly. I have to be honest with members and say I do not know what decision I would make. I saw my parents die very different deaths. My father suddenly of a heart attack very young, and my mother very slowly of a horrible asbestos-related disease. I do not know what they would have wanted. I do not know what I would want. But I do know that I want everybody else to have the choice that they want. And so I think the time has come when we should recognise this petition, what it's asking us to do, and look at a very narrow form of agreement to assisted dying when someone has a terminal diagnosis and has made that decision at a time when they were mentally capable of doing it, that there is a medical intervention involved, and that ultimately they get to make the last and perhaps most important and most personal decision that they could make. Thank you.
Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And we need an informed debate on this subject. And I believe we're starting to have the level of engagement and interest that means that now is the time to bring a vote to the floor of the House. As Health Secretary, I was surprised to find a paucity of information and data around this question when asking policy questions. And I asked the Office for National Statistics to start to collect some of that data. And one of the things they found is that the suicide rate amongst those who have a terminal illness is double the suicide rate in the rest of the population. So we know that suicide happens and is more prevalent, twice as prevalent, amongst those with a terminal illness. But of course, we also know that many of those suicides are lonely, and many of them are earlier than they would have been if we had changed the law. I've also been informed in this debate, and in me coming to a view on it myself, by engagement with others. I pay tribute to the Select Committee and their excellent report. I was influenced very significantly by Sir Paul Cosford, the late Medical Director of Public Health England, who was a great man and who asked to speak to me whilst he was Emeritus Medical Director. And he called me to tell me that he had a terminal illness. It was cancer. He knew that there was a likelihood of a painful end. And he said, as a medical doctor, I, of course, can prescribe myself morphine, and I know what to do with it. But he said, but you and others don't have that choice. And I was also deeply affected and persuaded by my constituent, David Minns. And today I had the honour of meeting his son, Matt Minns. And David, who has now died, he was in the awful situation of having a disease that he himself had watched his own daughter die an incredibly painful death. And to those who say palliative care needs to be better and palliative care can be enough, of course it needs to be better. And of course people give their careers to amazing palliative care. But the best palliative care in the world cannot prevent hugely painful deaths for some. So yes, the safeguards are vital. Internationally, we now can see many states, many countries, like Australia, that have brought in a narrow and a clear set of rules. But the people I want to have the choice are those facing a painful death when they know that death is coming, with the protections, of course, for people with disabilities, for those with mental ill health, but making sure that all of us should have the choice when we know for certain we're facing such pain at the end that we can instead have a dignified and good death. And I know I'd want that choice for myself.
So Stephen Timms.
I very much welcome the thoughtful and sensitive way my honourable friend opened this debate, and I agree with her and with others that we need very careful reflection on this subject. The National Health Service is rightly my party's proudest achievement. It's delivered freedom from the fear of medical bills which blighted the lives of non-wealthy people since time immemorial. Changing the nature of the National Health Service so that it ends people's lives as well as sustaining them would, I think, be an absolutely fundamental change, which we need to weigh very, very carefully indeed before introducing. I understand the proposition that people with a diagnosis of terminal illness should be allowed help to die, but it's clear from what happens elsewhere that if that did happen, it would not remain a narrow criterion. It wouldn't end there. The campaign, indeed, to broaden the scope has already begun. Matthew Paris wrote in his Times column that we need assisted suicide because old people cost too much. Quoting from his column, "Your time is up," he wrote, "will never be an order, but yes, the objectors are right, may one day be the kind of unspoken hint that everybody understands, and that's a good thing," end of quote. Well, I can't see that would be a good thing. Legalising assisted dying would, it seems to me, impose a terrible dilemma on frail people, elderly people and others when they're at the most vulnerable point in their lives, especially on conscientious, frail people who don't want to die but don't want to be a burden. And I don't think there's any way to avoid imposing that dilemma. The National Health Service should be there to protect those people. It's reported that in Oregon, since 2017, over half of the applicants for assisted dying have applied not because they wanted to die, but because they felt they were a burden. And the next time we have a government committed to austerity, the temptation to cut health service costs by allowing people to choose to end their lives in a wider set of circumstances instead of funding their care would, I fear, be irresistible. And indeed, in Canada, the government publishes how much it's saved by ending people's lives rather than continuing to care for them. That's a road, Sir Robert.
Right on.
I will.
I'm very grateful. I'll be very brief. Doesn't he accept that the arguments he's just been making is a very bleak view about how this would work in practice?
Well, I do very much agree with my right honourable friend that it's a bleak view, but I think it is a view that's supported by what we've seen happening elsewhere around the world, and which I think, unfortunately, would happen here as well. So Robert, the argument I want to set out is that this road is not one which those of us who subscribe to Nye Bevan's health service founding principles should be willing to go down.
and for East Ham, and I agree with what he has said. Assisted dying is a complex subject, and if we are to make any progress in discussing it, we need careful reflection, informed debate. It's reasonable that reference to statistics should be made, but we do need to be careful in the use of them. What people understand by the term assisted dying makes a difference. In 2021, a Survation poll asked over 1,000 members of the public what they thought the term assisted dying meant. Only 4 in 10 correctly understood it to mean providing those with less than 6 months to live lethal drugs to end their life. However, the same proportion incorrectly thought that it meant giving people who are dying the right to stop life-prolonging treatment, something that is already legal in the UK. And concerningly, 1 in 10 said it referred to the provision of hospice-type care for people who are dying. So 6 in 10 did not understand what the term assisted dying actually means. We do need to ensure that our constituents are fully informed as to what assisted dying means and don't, quote, run there blindly, as the thoughtful article in yesterday's Sunday Times by Josh Glancy warns, as movingly referred to by the Honourable Member for Stroud. In light of this, let us consider a recent Dignity in Dying poll. It concluded that 75% of Brits supported assisted dying. Incidentally, this has fallen from 84% in a 2019 Populous poll. But how strong actually is this supposed support? The same recent poll found that only 4 in 10 of those polled actually wanted their MP to vote in favour of assisted dying. It seems that out of the initial 75%, almost half didn't support the cause enough to want the law to change on it. So to proclaim that nearly 8 in 10 Britons want assisted dying therefore cannot be accepted as a fair representation. A more committed and thorough approach to understanding what our constituents think might lead us to reflect on a 2014 ComRes poll. This found that the proportion of people who supported assisted dying, although initially when asked stood at 7 out of 10, fell dramatically to 4 in 10 when respondents were actually presented with a full picture of the arguments against assisted dying and were equipped to make a more informed decision. And this I found too in the 2015 debate, when I recall that several colleagues entered the chamber without a firm view on assisted dying, but they firmly voted against it after they heard the arguments in the debate and the implications of changing the law on assisted dying and what it would mean for this country.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Sir Robert. I very much welcome this much-needed debate and want to make 3 points very briefly. The first one is to reiterate the issue around inequality, because the current blanket ban on assisted dying doesn't just rob dying people of any meaningful choice, it also perpetuates inequality. We've heard about the £15,000 it costs to go to Dignitas, but people often have to go alone as the law prevents any assistance from their loved ones, as we know, otherwise they might face prosecution when they return. But it does mean people are going much earlier than they need to because they have to be well enough to make the journey, so they die too soon. But for those who can't even afford to travel abroad, the choices they're left with are even fewer. They may be subject to a lottery of compassionate but illegal cooperation from their healthcare providers. Others may feel forced to take things into their own hands in violent and lonely ways, and yet others choose available options to hasten their deaths with the support of doctors, such as refusing food and water. I would argue that rather than keeping people safe right now, we are actually currently inadvertently permitting assisted dying, yet in a way that lacks any regulation or oversight, or indeed compassion. And that brings me to safeguards, because they are important. And I know some have concerns, for example, about how assisted dying could inadvertently reinforce the discrimination that people with disabilities already face. So I want to be clear that resourcing and enabling disabled people to live dignified, full and long lives must be an absolute priority for us all, irrespective of our views on assisted dying. But I want to be clear too that the proposals being considered at the moment have explicitly and purposefully been for terminally ill, mentally competent adults. In other words, disabled people without a terminal prognosis would be deemed ineligible for an assisted death at the first stage. The current law doesn't eradicate demand for assisted dying. It just drives practices overseas or behind closed doors where there are no safeguards in place to protect people. In fact, introducing a strictly safeguarded law with tight restrictions is the best way to protect those at risk of pressure to hasten their deaths against their wishes. It's wrong to think that current practices within end-of-life care do not already demand the medical profession to be alert to the possibility of coercive control. A change in the law could strengthen doctors' skills in that area, enhance our understanding and our ability to protect against it. So, for example, we could have mandated training so doctors recognise even more easily the signs of coercion, and critically, creating a specific criminal offence for the act of coercing a person into an assisted death. Some have argued that more resources for palliative care is the answer, and of course I want to see that. But even the best palliative care can't help everyone. And we've seen growing evidence from places like France and Queensland in Australia that the introduction of assisted dying can be a powerful catalyst to improve palliative care. So in closing, I want to say that I think palliative care needs more funding, the hospice movement needs more funding, but that doesn't take away from the importance of giving people choice at the end of life. I'm proud that the Green Party will commit to supporting a change in the law in our manifesto for the next general election. I hope very much that other parties will do the same.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Sir Robert. Look around. This is a packed Westminster Hall. Extra seating brought in. I wager that there are more colleagues here than there are in the main chamber. Apologies to Mel. This is a big day, and as chair of the APPG for bereavement, I very much welcome this debate and congratulate Esther Ranson and the whole of the campaign for dignity in dying for bringing this to our attention today. We rightly call this place the mother of all parliaments. We're proud. We're a global exemplar of policy debated and how it's advanced and so forth. But on this issue, it's been the people who have had to nudge us, Parliament, by way of petition that brings us all here today. But I do believe we're starting to do justice by the quality of the debate that I'm pleased to participate in. We must now have the courage to take this further, because this Act is out of date. 1961 Suicide Act. Anyone involved in assisting another person's death could be subject to 14 years custodial sentence. Well, the world has changed since 1961. Well, firstly, medicines significantly extend life, but in doing so, we also keep people alive longer, but their quality of life isn't necessarily the same. And of course, as we're illustrating here today, attitudes are changing. 77%, forgive me, in Bournemouth, a poll suggests, are actually supportive of changing the law. Yet since the establishment of Dignitas in Switzerland in 1998, some Britons have chosen to travel to Zurich, paying £10,000 to £15,000 in order to say goodbye to their loved ones on the family's terms. And for the last decade, the Crown Prosecution Service, I understand, has actually not charged anyone for assisted dying. The law, as it stands, is not working. It's not enforced. And the UK Parliament has not kept up with the contemporary thinking within Britain itself, but also compared with other countries, as we heard, France, New Zealand, Australia, Spain, Austria, Holland, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, and of course, Switzerland as well. The world's position is changing and modernising, and we must do the same here as well. The current system fails on 3 accounts. Firstly, the terminal illness. There's potential experience for pain and mental hardship as the body slows and loses strength. It obliges families and loved ones to witness that deterioration, causing its own stress. And finally, as I heard from members of the Dignity in Dying just an hour ago, there is also the added anxiety of not knowing for sure if there's going to be a knock on the door from the Crown Prosecution Service. We can and must do better. Now, debates come and go in Parliament, policy is discussed, written up in Hansard, but occasionally there are big days when the public is watching, when we remember where we are and what is said. Today is one of those days. Let's make today's debate count. Let this be the start of the process that gives real choice to those who are terminally ill. It's time to change the law with government legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Sir Robert. The Guardian is not known for its conservative zeal on any campaigning issue, but in a brilliant article by Sonia Sada on the 7th of April, she outlined some things which I think should be compulsory reading for anyone who's engaging in this debate. She deals with this issue of coercion. And she comments that in a day and age when coercive control is the norm for many in relationships, she blows a hole through the notion that we are in actually a free society to make these decisions when many in our society are in fact not free at all. They are coerced, they're subject to conditioning, they are influenced by what becomes wrongly called the new cultural norm in our society. 1/3 of every female who takes their own life through suicide in the United Kingdom, that suicide is related to intimate partner abuse. Just think of it. We've all read the stories, we've all seen the court reports and read the various things and heard from our constituents of coercive and abusive control on females in our society. I hate you. You're not worthy of my love. Your children hate you. Are you still alive? We've all heard it. We know what that does to people. We know what it drives to them. It controls them, and it makes it a very ugly environment for them to live in. That type of abuse is all too prevalent in our society. The elderly, similarly abused. Oh, mum and dad, they had a good life, you know. Oh, they're done. You know, they're done, really. It's going to be very costly to keep them in this health service. All that pressure builds. And all those people who tell us that there isn't coercion in people, there isn't anti-disability prejudice in this society, there isn't emotional abuse in this society, there isn't financial abuse in this society, they are wrong because there is, because they're all factors that influence a people and a person to say, maybe I should end my life at this point. Yes, I'll give way.
How does he explain that a doctor who diagnosed a terminal illness is part of that manipulative coercion?
That's actually a brilliant point. I want to turn to the issues of safeguards, because everyone here today, and some people here today, have talked about, well, there's going to be brilliant safeguards. Yet every single one of those members in this House has told me over the years, and told this House over the years, how rubbish law is, how it's failed here, it's deficient there, it's useless there. Yet we're going to come up with the best, most brilliant, most wonderful law in this matter that no one has ever seen before. And on this occasion, we're going to be able to achieve it. You know, the fact of the matter is, those people tell us that they're going to have safeguards, the very same people tell us every single day that they can't create those sort of safeguards. Look what happened in Canada. Canada told us in 2016 that there was going to be a very narrow scope for the legislation. That narrow scope has now turned into discussions about disability, about sick children, about chronic mental illness. They're now all within the purview of the Canadian law, which of course it was never, ever supposed to be. I think we are doing a huge disservice, Sir Robert, to palliative care, to doctors and nurses who care, who give their life to this, who want to see compassion at the end of life. And we are doing a huge disservice to those people. I believe, as some members have said, that there should be a national conversation on this. This should be a long debate. We really need to get into the weeds of this matter. But to think that because some people have signed a petition, suddenly this nation is ready to make the health service the service that is going to result in the end of people's lives, that is folly, and we should avoid it.
Terminal illness is distressing and difficult, both of, obviously, the person involved and their families and friends. And the cases we regularly hear about are truly moving and evoke the highest degree of compassion. When and how someone passes from this life is a really very challenging time and a very emotional topic. I raised this back in Parliament in 2011, expressing my concern about how the practice of withholding water and food in order to accelerate someone's death had been deemed lawful in court, though I was relieved after the Nyberger review that this was effectively stopped across the country. Assisting or encouraging suicide is a criminal offence under Section 2 of this 1961 Act. That Act has actually been updated by the Coroners and Justice Act in 2009, and there was an attempt then to change the law to have assisted suicide made legal in this country. And I wasn't in the House at the time of that passage, but fortunately, they failed on that time. What did come, though, was the guidelines that were put in place for
the Crown Prosecution Service by the then Director of Public Prosecutions, now the leader of His Majesty's opposition. And those rules do seem to have stood the test of time. And back in March 2012, when this House debated those rules, the House also voted against the proposal to make them statutory guidance while adding its support for palliative care and hospital provision. There's been a lot of talk about how somebody comes to the end of their death. I would say to the House, there's an overwhelming difference between clinicians knowingly giving medication to help accelerate that death, as opposed to something that may help with dealing with the pain, rather than mindfully to be set out to kill. I do think such ethical issues, though, do need to be considered as standalone bills, because unfortunately there are too many attempts to put quite significant changes to ethical issues through a government bill that often is rushed through, and actually significant changes happen with very little debate, if any debate at all. And so we come to the 11th September 2015, when the House had voted, and 330 MPs did vote against change the law. That was 3/4 of the MPs that voted that day. It wasn't an insignificant debate. 70% of the House actually participated in that division. But since then, no Member of Parliament has come forward with a bill for the House to consider, either through the ballot or by presenting a bill. And while I know a lot of constituents would like the change in the law, I still think the House would not make the changes, as we have seen the issues that have put doubt into people's minds. Many have talked about the experience of other countries. That alone shows evidence from around the world is exactly why we should not change the law. It is that acceleration that has happened. It is the situation where in Washington State, 1/4 of people in 2009 applied because they thought they were a burden. That had risen to 59%. And we're not talking about just people of older age. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. And is the honourable lady aware that at the same time that this country's parliament voted against legalising assisted suicide, in Canada a different decision was made, and in 2016, that year, the first year of medically assisted deaths, 1,000 people chose to have it. But by 2022, more than 13,000 people had availed themselves of that law, representing a 30% year-on-year increase.
Well, my honourable friend points out about how this starts to increase quite significantly. Yes. And it's also in Canada, where a distinguished Paralympian who was looking for help with their disability was offered assisted dying as an alternative to actually adaptation to their home. And it is, in particular, I know there's been a lot of discussion today about elderly people. We're not just talking about elderly people. We're talking about vulnerable people. We're talking about people with disability who could be taken advantage of to end their lives early, to have that element of being considered a burden. And people in this House have put forward that view of Matthew Paris, that it's perfectly rational to say that you're a burden and that you should be there potentially ending your life. No one should feel such a burden on their family, their friends and society that they should end their lives early. And that is why today, while I will upset several of my constituents, I do hold a different view to them on this matter, as I have consistently, and I will continue to want to make no changes to the law and leave it as it stands.
Egan.
Thank you to Robert and to my honourable friend Gower for her introduction. I feel privileged to be following so many compelling and thoughtful contributions. You don't have to speak to many people before you hear painful stories of extremely torturous, brutal deaths that people's loved ones have had to endure, often through extreme pain. I always thought I'd be one of those people who would say that a form of assisted death wouldn't be something for me or something that I'd encourage in loved ones. This weekend, I was talking to families, talking to a lot of people about this debate, and it was my nan, very wise woman, but she shared her story of her mum, who died of breast cancer at 61 and had a very, very difficult death. It made me feel that what I thought before was naive. But it was perhaps yesterday a woman from a local Save Our Green Spaces group who I was also talking to on a very different visit I was doing, that she said to me, we don't treat our pets and let them have such cruel deaths that we do with people. And I didn't have an answer for it. And it made me feel that surely we can do better. Now, as we move forward in this debate, I'd like to ask, or add my voice, for the need to exercise caution. With over 400 million people around the world living in countries and jurisdictions that have introduced a form of assisted dying. There is much to learn from, and I don't yet know the ins and outs of parliamentary procedure, but it's something that needs considerable thought and time. On one extreme, if you like, I was taken aback to read examples in the Netherlands where people ending their lives due to mental illness. I worry about assisted dying being seen as an alternative to palliative care, as people have said, people feeling like a burden on their families, and of course, coercion. But I bring members back to examples like Oregon, where legislation has existed for 27 years and hasn't actually been extended. Assisted dying is limited with strict safeguards. You have to have a terminal illness, life expectancy of less than 6 months, cooling off periods. And interestingly, a third of people who go down that route or start that route never take end-of-life drugs, but they're reassured that they have that choice if needed. It would need interrogating, but in 2019, it's reported that the executive director of the Disabled Rights Group of Oregon said that they hadn't received a complaint about coercion with disabled people. 2019, and would need interrogating. It's come with very good palliative care, and over 90% of those who died under the Death with Dignity Act are enrolled in hospice care. So, Robert, I appreciate that this is a very, Mrs. Latman, I appreciate this is a very complicated issue. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
A couple of years ago, on the near continent, a young woman of 23 years old was euthanized, having suffered from PTSD since 2016, when, although physically uninjured, she had witnessed school friends being blown to smithereens in the bombing of Brussels airport. I put it to you that if we use assisted dying as a therapy to end suffering for which other therapies exist, we will have made a profound transformation in assisted dying, changing it from being a means of ending suffering in death to a means of ending suffering in life. And I suggest that the trajectory is in that direction, as it has been in all those jurisdictions that introduced it. When I debated this subject against Baroness Meacher at Durham University, she at that time had a bill in the other place, and she was determined to constrain the debate to all the provisions that she'd made in that bill in terms of safeguard, diagnosis, number of doctors giving assent and all the rest. But she was completely hijacked by her seconder, who was a physician, a psychiatrist, who represented an organisation called My Life, My Death, who was determined that actually this was a therapy, a provision, a service that should be available to absolutely everyone. Now, I only want to make one further point. Aside from the fact that I actually accept that we've not voted on this for 3 parliaments, and we should determine what our position is. I would welcome a vote. But be careful what you wish for. Oregon has just released its statistics for last year. By far the largest cohort of applicants for the service are those who say they wanted it, 52%, wanted it because they didn't want to be a burden, far exceeding those who wanted it to avoid pain in death. There is a profound danger, in my view, that what begins as a choice will end as an expectation, and so proceeding, you will end up with Matthew Paris. And then it's not much of a jump till you're at Logan's Run. Don't know what it is, Mrs. Latham? Google it.
Shannon. a real pleasure to speak in this debate. Very poignant debate, but one which I would like to speak on as the DUP party spokesperson for health. The issue and topic is one of great importance and must be in line with our obligations to uphold and protect the sanctity of life. I'm going to say quite clearly, Madam Chair, I'm a Christian, I have a Christian faith. That's what drives me. It's why I'm here to represent my people. And I represent the thousands of my constituents who are opposed to assisted suicide. Introducing so-called assisted dying would fundamentally and irreversibly change the relationship between doctors and patients and how we think about healthcare. The duty of a doctor is to save life, not end it. It's the words of the Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm or administer any poison, even when asked to do so. Even the modernised versions of the oath, which all doctors must make, clearly states, I shall never intentionally cause harm to my patients and will have the utmost respect for human life. So that's very clearly from the doctor's point of view and what I want to speak about. I've been struck by the fear of those who have found to have cancer over 70. And I'm very happy.
Does he not accept, though, the harm to human life can involve existing in pain and acute distress?
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, but I'm going to give him an example. I refer to thousands of my constituents who have, and I'm going to give you an example of a lady who has cancer over 70. And those people who have to apologise for waiting for treatment to fight the cancer. This lady, she's 72-year-old, she says, I really do want to try to fight this cancer. That's her words. They will give me the chance. She felt guilty for taking resources, guilty for wanting to continue to live her life and help her daughter raise her child. So imagine the conversation. Just put it straight into your mind. For introducing assisted suicide would only increase the fears of vulnerable people and further damage the important trust between doctor and patient. The Isle of Man stats are very clear. I haven't the time to refer to them. The Royal College of GPs continues to oppose assisted suicide after the results of a consultation. The same thing, the British Medical Association did the same. And when the votes were analysed by the BMA, it was found that majorities of members whose work brought them into close and regular contact with terminally ill patients, including palliative medicine doctors, geriatricians, GPs, were opposed to the legislation, while respondents who had voted for legal change contained the majority of retired doctors, medical students and those in branches of medicine which involved little or no contact whatsoever with terminally or otherwise incurably ill patients. Happy to give way.
Thank the member for giving way. We're told that in terms of safeguards, one of the ideas is that 2 doctors and a judge will be able to make sure that there's plenty of safeguards here in future legislation. Does he agree that our courts have so far been utterly useless in finding family abuse in many situations, that doesn't offer a safeguard at all?
Yeah, I thank my honourable friend for that as well, and he's absolutely right. Again, he iterates the issue. 2 examples. Belgium, courts have ruled that doctors have an obligation to make effective referrals, even if they themselves are unwilling to take part in assisted dying. Canada's the very same. My goodness, the honourable gentleman who spoke before me reiterated the point very clearly. In other words, there's a duty to inform patients that an assisted death is an option. That should never, ever be the case. It's not too hard to see how, in such a context, of vulnerable people may feel they ought to end their lives early to avoid being a burden or because of medical advice. Assisted suicide can never be just about one person and their own choices. It would irreversibly transform the role of the NHS and the patient-doctor dynamic. I finish with this comment, Madam Chair. We must not allow this to happen. The duty of doctors in society as a whole is to care for the vulnerable, and we must therefore continue to resist attempts to introduce assisted suicide. And as lawmakers in this House, we must err on the side of caution to ensure that the option of assisted dying does not lead to pressure on those who are older, are vulnerable, feeling that the best thing to do would be to go quietly, save the money and pressure on the NHS, when instead they could have 10 more years to live a full life, enriching the lives of their family and community. This is a very serious debate. We all know that. We have different opinions, but I'm clearly on the side of supporting people to have a longer life, and assisted suicide is not something that I can ever support.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I greatly respect the campaigners who are proposing a change in the law and the people who signed the petition. Nevertheless, it is not the case that the majority of the public support what is euphemistically called assisted dying. When the details of the proposed law change are explained, you get a majority of people who oppose a change in the law. And crucially, and most importantly, the doctors who work with the dying, people in palliative care, geriatric care, GPs, overwhelmingly oppose a change in the law because they know what we're talking about. Nor is it the case Madam Chair, that in countries which have legalised assisted dying, happy to give way.
Doctors supporting a change in law than were opposed.
The BMA has decided to be neutral on this matter, but the crucial question, and most of them are not doctors who are working with the dying and the elderly. I accept that a majority of doctors have now accepted a change in the overall position. What I'm talking about is people who know what they're talking about, with great respect to the honourable gentleman, who I understand has a lot of knowledge of this topic as well. The point I'm making is that while there might be overall polls that suggest public support, in fact, professionals and members of the public, and in fact MPs, when they get the chance to look at this closely, end up opposing a change in the law for good reason. What does go up in... I was going to quickly mention palliative care services do not rise in comparative to in countries where they've legalised assisted dying relative to countries which haven't. It flatlines. Of course, they all go up because the populations are ageing, but actually palliative care services do decline in countries which have legalised assisted suicide. What does go up? Happy to give way again.
Every single jurisdiction, there was no evidence that palliative care declined in those countries which adopted assisted dying. There was only evidence that it had opened a debate which had led to an increase in improvement in palliative care.
The point I just made is not that it declines, that it doesn't increase comparative to countries where it is not legal. And often the increase in investment in palliative care is actually because there's more spending going on assisted dying, which has now been legalised in those countries. I'm very happy to take up this point offline because I think it's a very important question, and I recognise that the honourable gentleman in his report looked closely at this. But I think there is an important point about the investment in palliative care that we see in countries which have assisted dying and those which don't. Another point, and I'm not sure this was in the report, what does go up in countries which have legalised assisted suicide is suicide itself in the general population. The fact is that suicide is contagious. We see suicides among people who would not be eligible for the law increase in countries which have legalised it. And I'm afraid that is understandable when you consider that the government has told society that some people will be better off dead. We have policies in this country to prevent suicide. We want to stop people committing suicide. And I think it's absolutely important we recognise the potential implication of a change in the law for others. And as this suggests, Madam Chair, this is a profoundly moral question. I recognise that there are people with deeply held beliefs on either side. I recognise there is a quasi-religious belief in the notion of autonomy and choice as the only moral question in this debate, and I've heard that suggested. It is important to acknowledge that it is the people with the least agency, the least autonomy, the vulnerable, the disabled, the mentally ill, the frail, the lonely, who are the people who, in every country that this law has been changed, are the ones who suffer. And it is not surprising, and I'm again, happy to demonstrate this offline, there's no time for it. Every country that legalises assisted suicide starts with very tight restrictions and it expands. The scope expands, the access expands, and I will demonstrate that offline after this debate because it is absolutely true. Happy to give way.
Every country that was chosen, we looked at this as a select committee in detail. There is not a single jurisdiction which has defined its law in terms of terminal illness that has chosen to broaden it.
The definition of terminal illness is incredibly difficult, and you can always find a doctor to demonstrate it. That has happened in Oregon, in Canada, in all of these countries. Again, let me take this up offline because I respect the honourable gentleman's position here, but I stand on this point, that the scope, the access, the eligibility expands, and of course it does, because expansion is implicit in the principle.
Will the honourable member give way on that?
Happy to give way.
I note from the assisted suicide report produced by the Health and Social Care Committee, wherever the boundaries are set, evidence from other jurisdictions shows that the boundaries are eroded and criteria expanded, with concomitant escalation in numbers most markedly seen in Canada. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this is the concern he's trying to express?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. And these things are very contentious, and there are issues around definition. But I do stand on this principle that there is implicit expansion in the scope of any law. And I quickly will quote, if I may. I don't know if I'm given extra time for the interventions I'm taking, or then I won't. Okay. Baroness Campbell, herself a wheelchair user, says this: the present law rests on a natural frontier, which is that you don't kill people. What the proponents of assisted dying want is to replace that clear and bright line with an arbitrary and permeable one. If terminal illness, why not chronic and progressive conditions? And if chronic and progressive conditions, why not seriously disabled people? It is difficult, it is impossible to make distinctions between these terms, and that's why the law has within it always the scope for its own expansion, and that's why we should oppose it.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak on this important issue, and it's an honour to follow my honourable friend. The supporters of the petition want to alleviate suffering at the end of life, and this is commendable motivation and something we can all agree on. However, making it legal for doctors to help people kill themselves is simply not the answer, and I believe it is so important that we're all clear that what we're talking about today, we're dealing with assisted suicide, not assisted dying. We need to be clear because politicians and the public need to know what they're being asked to consider. We're all in favour of helping people in their dying moments, comforting them, relieving their pain, but that is categorically different from bringing in a law which says that killing yourself is an acceptable thing to do. I actually, like many today, find this topic emotional to deal with. On the 11th of June last year, my dad passed away aged 66, having suffered from cancer for almost 5 years. Loved beyond measure, my dad had great faith and never feared dying because he knew he was going to his heavenly home. But his cancer was absolutely horrendous. It was a thief and it caused him immense pain and suffering, particularly in the last 2 years of his life. But despite the suffering, my dad knew that there was an appointed time for him, for his home calling, and it wasn't for him or any other to decide in that time. The palliative care and cancer care that he received was exceptional. With further investment, it could be even better. So I speak today not as someone who hasn't experienced a loved one who suffered with terminal illness. I know the journey, but I also know the one thing these people don't need is the law telling them that their lives aren't worth living or that they're costing too much. We need to tell such people that they are valued, they're important, we care for them no matter the cost, and we must put our money where our mouth is and ensure that all those who need it can access high-quality, specialised palliative care.
I thank her for giving way and for sharing her story, which I understand is very personal. Does she not accept, though, that the choice that her father made is a choice that will never be taken away from him through changing the law? The choice is that you can opt to end your life, but for those who are happy to continue their life until it comes to an end, that choice will never be taken away from them.
But as we've heard, and I will go on in my speech to expand on this, when the law is introduced, it is expanded, and these potential safeguards are not safeguards at all, and it's a slippery slope. By investing in social care, by continuing to be a world leader in palliative care, by being a society that respects life and upholds the dignity of the elderly and people with disabilities, we can give hope to the hopeless and create a society where assisted suicide is not needed. Ms. Latham, the consequences of introducing assisted suicide are not a matter for speculation. The practice has been implemented in other countries, not unlike ours, and when assisted suicide is permitted, it is a slippery slope. Whenever assisted suicide has been legalised, however tight the initial safeguards and however sincere the assurances that it would be a narrowly defined law for rare cases, the practice has rapidly expanded. Canada, it only took 5 years. I'm going to just make progress. It only took 5 years from the introduction of assisted suicide in 2016 for those whose death was reasonably foreseeable to an expansion to the ill-defined serious and incurable illnesses criteria in 2021. In Oregon and the US, people have been given assisted deaths because of diabetes, hernias, arthritis and anorexia, with the terminal illness interpretation now wide and wielding. Netherlands and Belgium, where child euthanasia has been legalised, as well as euthanasia for mental illness and dementia. I want to conclude by quoting the Danish National Council on Ethics. Having considered the issue in detail, including examining the evidence from supposedly safe places like Oregon, it concluded the only thing that will be able to protect the lives of those who are most vulnerable in society will be a ban without exceptions. It's time to invest in better palliative care, support those who go over and above to support those in their dying hour. Leave the law as it is. We must resist this change. Thank you.
Up.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms. Latham. 581 people in my East Devon constituency have signed this petition. Make that 582, as I want to put on record my support for the principle of assisted dying for the first time. I recognise the arguments on both sides. My personal view is deeply held. My view was strengthened recently on a stroll around Sidmouth, where I live. An older gentleman was tending to his garden when he decided to strike up a conversation. He explained the garden was his wife's pride and joy, but as she was now in a local care home, it's his turn to do some pruning. At this point, I could see he wanted to cry. In a very British way, he apologised, but went on to explain why he felt so emotional. His dear wife, the love of his life, is terminally ill, has no quality of life, and lives in constant pain and can't leave her bed. He visits her every day, and every single day, she tells him she doesn't want to be here anymore. It was clearly breaking his heart. The gentleman suddenly straightened up, looked me square in the eye, and asked me if I supported assisted dying. The look of relief when I said yes was palpable, and we shared an emotional moment together. I'll never forget that conversation, and as I continued my stroll, one thought rang constantly in my head. My view shouldn't matter. Assisted dying, with appropriate safeguards, should be the law now. Who are any of us here today to deny people that ultimate freedom, that choice to end the pain? The blanket ban on assisted dying forces people to suffer against their wishes. The only legal solution involves going abroad at enormous expense, which is out of reach for most people. Dignity in dying shouldn't just be available for the privileged few. Assisted dying does not replace palliative care and end-of-life services, as we've heard today. Someone approaching the end of their life or living with serious illness should be provided with the care and treatment they need to maximise the quality of life and minimise any suffering or distress. In my view, assisted dying should be an additional choice that terminally ill, mentally competent adults with 6 months or less to live should be able to make because they want more control over the manner and timing of their death. Currently, there are terminally ill people in constant pain who are living against their wishes. That's cruel. If I was terminally ill, in unbearable agony, with no quality of life, I'd want a choice. Whatever happens next truly frightens me, but I want there to be that freedom, a decision in my hands and no one else's. Suffering should not be inevitable. I hope to one day vote in favour of a policy which ends a cruel reality for far too many people.
Sarah Dyke.
It's an honour to serve with you in the chair, and I thank the Honourable Member for Gower for bringing forward this important debate. And I'd also like to thank the petitioners, including 645 of them in Somerton and Frome, who added their names, and to everyone who reached out to me ahead of this debate. Your experiences have touched me deeply, as have the experiences of members here today. One constituent wrote to me about her son, Jonathan, who died in a hospice at the age of 46. His family told me that the tragedy of his death was made so much worse by the lack of provision for assisted dying. Jonathan's mother, Denise, gave me a quote that I think sums up today's debate very well. It's not about ending life, it's about shortening death. I would like to mention Dorothy House, which offers free palliative care and end-of-life care across much of my constituency. They remain neutral on this issue, but shared their ethos with me earlier today. Dorothy House has a vision of a society where death is a part of life. Mrs. Latham, I can't thank Dorothy House enough for the support that they provided me and my partner while we were caring for my partner's mother in her final few months as she was dying of cancer. Having cared and watched this strong, independent, and dignified woman fade away in considerable pain, unable to have the dignified death that she wanted, will forever haunt me. The UK public have stated that they would support provisions to make assisted dying legal in the UK. Research carried out in January this year by Dorothy House, which gathered 401 responses, showed that 69% of respondents would support the law being changed to allow assisted dying for someone suffering from a terminal illness. These findings are backed up by a recent poll by Opinion for Dignity in Dying, which showed that 75% of people in the UK are supportive of assisted dying. Their analysis showed that there is a majority support for assisted dying in every constituency in the country. In areas of Glastonbury and Somerton, 80% of people are supportive of the change, making it the third highest supportive new constituency in the country. I am committed to championing the freedom, dignity and well-being of individuals, respecting their right to freedom of conscience. But the issue is complex and divisive. hence why it's vitally important that any legislation that provides for medical assistance to die in particular circumstances is subject to rigorous safeguards and regulations. This is also why it's important that this topic is debated fully in Parliament and any new legislation is robustly scrutinised. And I hope that we can be reassured today that we will see progress made over the forthcoming parliamentary sessions. Thank you.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. They will always provide and provoke many feelings and emotions, ones that, no matter what side of the argument you're on, we should respect. Whatever one's views, and I've heard nothing today that hasn't convinced me otherwise, we cannot argue, I think, on one's personal sovereignty, that an individual has the right to choose, and they should have the dignity to choose how to end one's suffering, provided there are the right safeguards. And, Madam Chair, often in this place it's said that if you speak with a level of passion about a subject you care about, the speech will resonate more. I lost my stepfather, my dad, suddenly in July 2019. It was just 5 months before I was elected to this place. He was well known all over North Norfolk, and my dad, I know, would have been proud of the accomplishment that saw me to this place that he sadly never got to then witness. He was the inspiration for my foray into local politics. He never imagined I would get here, but without him I wouldn't have risen through those ranks in local politics just to serve that community. My stepfather had a heart attack on Good Friday 2019, and in his usual style, he just dismissed it. It was just one of those things. Actually, he needed a quadruple heart bypass. And just weeks later, he suffered a sudden, unexpected, and dreadfully debilitating stroke. Just a few days later, he passed peacefully, back in his own home, in his own bed, looking out into his own gardens, where he wanted to be. Now, we were very lucky. We were lucky, I say that, because my stepfather always knew that he did not want to suffer for years on end if this sort of eventuality ever happened to him. He had a vision for what he wanted, how he wanted to die, and he had a living will that the doctors in the hospital adhered to and respected. This was a proud man, rooted in his community, 45 years building up his own business in the town that was his home. He didn't want to be pushed around in a wheelchair, fed by somebody else, or his grandchildren sitting on his knee that he didn't even recognise anymore. If he had a condition, a stroke, or any other terminal illness, he would rather not be here. And I know that I speak for millions of people around the country who too would want the dignity and the respect to pass peacefully, if they so choose. Indeed, I'm very lucky that one of my constituents, Zoe Marley, has come here today all the way from North Norfolk. She has been a tower of strength in her determination to see a change in the law. Zoe lost her mother and her husband within a couple of years, both to painful terminal cancers, and they both assisted themselves to die after a battle with their cancer. And I thank her for all of her determination over assisted dying.
Nietzsche.
I commend the petitioners for allowing us to have this debate, because many of my constituents believe we should be pro-choice in specific ways, not the current no-choice situation that most people have. People who don't have the means to go to Switzerland have no choice but to suffer in pain or try to have secret, illegal conversations with medical people who make it difficult for everybody to be able to endure and to be able to allow them to have a good quality death. My good friend and colleague, Debbie Woodworth, asked me to fight for assisted dying. Debbie had terminal cancer where tumours meant that she couldn't swallow or digest food anymore. She was as bright as a button, determined, passionate, an excellent local councillor that we lost too soon. And in the last week that I met with Debbie before she died, I said to her, as many people do when you're with your friends, what can I do to help? Is there anything you need? And she said to me, yes, you're in just the right place. I need you to fight for assisted dying. I believe that we should fight for euthanasia for certain illnesses. She texted me the things that she wanted me to say. I have signet ring cell carcinoma. It had to be a jewellery-related condition with me. They also sometimes refer to it as goblet cell carcinoma. I'm not really sure why they give them those names as they do, because when I see the pictures, I see no resemblance to them. I wish I had more time. I've not done all the things I want to do yet. Debbie, in her last week, was in a lot of pain, but she knew what she wanted. And last thing she said to me was, "You asked me what you can do for me. Please support assisted dying. Give people who have terrible illnesses like me that are terminal and very, very life-limiting the choice as to when and how to die."
Chloe Smith.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Amon, and I'm also grateful for having been able to attend the statement in the main chamber earlier on as well. We last debated this nearly a decade ago, in 2015. The Commons vote failed to reflect public opinion then, but MPs could take the chance to do so now. It is my view that we should have a thorough and fresh debate on this, especially as other places have increasingly got experience, which we hear from the Health and Social Care Committee, to share of how assisted dying laws can work well. And I think it is notable that none of the 31 that have put these laws in place have repealed them. Now, I speak in favour of the proposition, and I'm very, very pleased that petitioners have brought it. I voted as such in 2015, and I make the same arguments now. I was in the minority on that vote in that day, but I hope that there would shortly be a majority for it. I do believe that terminally ill people who are mentally sound and near the end of their lives should not suffer unbearably against their will. They should have the option of requesting medical help to end their lives with dignity through a safe and compassionate system with strict criteria and safeguards. It is their life, it is their death, it is their choice, not anybody else's. Under the core proposal, indeed, it's not only a choice, it's also not compulsory. Without such provision in our law, too many are taking matters into their own hands with absolutely tragic consequences. People are forced to take often hidden, undignified and desperate action. They should be able to have an open conversation with their doctor instead. It's not okay to have to refuse food. It's not okay to have to afford to go to Switzerland. And the problems here are twofold in our law. It's not just that the law forces honest people to go underground. The law is also not currently neutral. The debate we have today is about a choice that had already been taken in law. We are not starting, in fact, from neutral ground, but we do have to apply our best work to this as legislators. The main problem in that lack of neutrality is that it is heartbreaking to make carers risk a charge on top of their grief. One constituent said to me, in the 21st century, we should be having an adult debate about this. We should protect family members or friends who risk prosecution for assisting. Another constituent added, this is a subject that as a caring and civilised country, we can no longer ignore. I hope this issue can finally be addressed in Parliament. I agree with my constituent. We should bring these quite awful ethical choices into the light, giving people dignity and support. People are suffering cruelly. I hope the next generation of MPs will take courage.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. On May the 7th, surrounded by her family, Shanti Ducote was euthanised. She was 23 years old. 6 years earlier, on March 22nd, 2016, Shanti had been at a Brussels airport when terrorists set off bombs. Her assisted death has been added to the number killed in that atrocity. She suffered immensely with PTSD. 2 p.m. on Friday the 26th of February 2018, 29-year-old Aurelia Brouwers was allowed to end her life on account of psychiatric illness. 28-year-old Zariah Tabak has chosen euthanasia because of crippling depression. She is 28, scheduled to die in May. Does anybody here want to be a part of a decision that allows a young person to schedule their death? I don't. In the Netherlands, euthanasia has now accounted for 5% of all deaths. I cannot support a policy that takes life, because life is God-given and it is precious. The thought of killing someone just because they are old or in poor health makes me feel desperate for the state of our society. It almost makes me see how naive our society is becoming. Naive that if this policy ever came into force, that it would remain in a tightly controlled way. As we have seen in other countries, assisted dying starts with the terminally ill, but too often the scope is widened to include disabled individuals and, as the three women I mentioned previously, individuals with mental health issues. How many of our population are struggling with mental health at present will no doubt, after a relatively short period of time, be back having a good and meaningful life once more. Yet sadly, if we follow this example, we will be ending young people's lives in their 20s and 30s. And anyone who thinks this would never happen on their watch, it would only ever happen for the terminally ill. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but they are wrong. None of us will be in this place forever, so we will not be able to forever control where this legislation ends. But we would have been the ones who started this, and therefore forever culpable. No, we cannot and should not start on this journey. As I stated at the beginning of this speech, I cannot support this bill because I believe life is precious, far too precious. It is God-given, and only He should ever take it away.
Robin Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, can I give my thanks to the Honourable Member for Gower for bringing this debate forward on behalf of those who've answered this petition. It is really important that we represent those who write to us, and I, like many other colleagues here, will have had many, emails and letters on this subject. But I would just add a note there, and there's 2 points I want to make. So on this first point, I would just add this note of caution. And that is that as parliamentarians, it's our job not only to represent those with a voice, those who are motivated, those who are interested, those who are engaged, those who do grab our attention. It's also to represent those without a voice, those who are vulnerable, those who can't speak, those who speak with a very quiet voice. It is our duty to represent their interests and consider their situation as well. And I think that's a really important balance that we must bring to this. So I make no apology for bringing that into this debate. And I want to commend the Honourable Member for Gower for bringing that balance into the tone with which she set this debate. If we're to have these debates, it's really important it's done in the right way, and the tone she set was very helpful, and I thank her for that. I also want to thank the Health and Social Care Select Committee for their report, because I have found that very helpful with the facts that they've presented. And again, the approach they've taken to that, I commend it to all people to read, because there are many good and useful points in this. The second point that I want to make, though, and there's very little time available for any, so I'll leave it at this, is some might characterise it as a slippery slope, some might characterise it as the thin end of a wedge, and I too was appalled, I confess, reading what Matthew Parris wrote about it, and the way in which he wrote it and presented it, I found it to be crude and unnecessarily so in the debate. But I want to speak about the issue of normalising. And it has been made, and the point's been made in other places, that suicide rates in countries where this legislation is introduced actually go up. And it's that normalising that I have a particular concern of this afternoon as we've debated. Because in Scotland, for example, the Assisted Dying for Terminally Ill Adults Bill includes a definition of terminal illness, which could be seen to include things like type 1 diabetes or rheumatoid arthritis. And my concern is, and I quote the Health and Social Care's Select Report, again, where it says, page 45, wherever the boundaries are set, evidence from other jurisdictions shows that the boundaries are eroded and criteria expanded. And my concern is, yes, sir.
I agree. I was following this argument comments very carefully from earlier on. That citation he makes from the report is in itself a quote from a campaign group rather than a finding of the committee.
I thank the Honourable Member for making that. It stands as it is, and I refer every interested reader to the context of that. The point to the Honourable Member, and then.
I think it's necessary for accuracy within this debate. If he refers to page 96, paragraph 7 of the report, the Select Committee said, quote, "We also conclude that jurisdictions which have introduced ADAS on the basis of terminal illness have not changed the law to include eligibility on the basis of unbearable suffering." Unquote.
I remember he's put that comment on the record. I give way to Strangford.
To add to his concerns over some of the suggestions that are coming out of Scotland, and he referred to one of the things that have been quoted, even young girls who may have anorexia could find themselves in a position where they might feel that they are constrained to do that. And I make this point, Madam Chair, it's very important. I know that the health service saved the life of one of my constituents by whenever she was in difficult times, by going to St Thomas's Hospital just across the way. They saved her life, and it could have very well been the other way round.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and I think this speaks to my concern about a normalisation. Because if we introduce the legislation which says it is acceptable to end life for a wider range of conditions, and as I say, the evidence before us in Scotland is that interpretation is correct, then we risk normalising suicide as a prescription. And that, I'll happily give way.
I think he's making a really perfect point in terms of Clause 2 of the proposed bill going through the Scottish Parliament at the moment. And there is no mention of 12 months. There's no mention of a person dying within a particular time. It's simply about aspects of a condition from which they're unable to recover and can be reasonably expected to cause premature death. And it's that sort of worry that we have, interpretation of the law, that has undoubtedly expanded around the world, such that we've seen the increase in number of people with assisted suicide.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for her intervention. And I would just conclude with this point, Madam Chairman. We must never get to a point where assisted dying is seen as a prescription. We must never get to a point, I hope, where we see death as a treatment. Thank you.
Wind-ups will now begin. Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mrs Latham. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And it's an honour to speak for the official opposition in this e-petition debate, calling on the government to allocate parliamentary time for a debate and a vote on assisted dying. The debate follows the campaign by Dignity in Dying, the Daily Express, and Dame Esther Ranson, and the petition signed by over 200,000 UK residents, including over 200 of my own constituents. And I thank my honourable friend for the Gower for her considered opening speech. And I also thank the members of the Select Committee and for the work they have done in informing this debate. I should start by making my own view clear. I support reforming the law in favour of assisted dying. I voted for reform in the Private Members' Bill debate in 2015, and I have spoken in previous debates in this chamber on the subject. Today, Mrs Latham, we've heard powerful, deeply held views from many right honourable and honourable members, some supporting change, some not, and some still with an open mind. This has again been a truly cross-party debate and one that is in the very best traditions of this House. And now, as I'm speaking from the opposition front bench, I can reiterate both the Leader of the Opposition and the Shadow Secretary of State for Health have said that if elected, a future Labour government would provide parliamentary time and a vote on changing the law. The process in issues of conscience like this means that it would be for a Member of Parliament, rather than the government, to bring forward this law change. That it then be debated and refined on a cross-party basis, with each member free to speak and vote according to their own conscience. Then, any government must ensure that any proposal carries with it proper and strong safeguards. It damages the cause if such reforms are rushed through with inadequate consideration. If any reforms do not recognise the concerns that many people have, including those who support reform in principle, then we will not receive the consensus that any change must have. The Honourable Member for Holton, Price and Howden addressed the issue of concern that in Canada and the Netherlands, issues of cognitive impairment or mental illness may be reasons for people to consider mental illness. We must listen to those concerns. And we must also listen to those who are or who represent the elderly, people with disabilities, and those who face life-changing conditions. How long have I got? Oh, okay. Yes.
There's been lots of talk of Canada today, so I just wanted to place on the record something that it is true that in Canada they did extend the MAID, the medical assisted dying provisions, to include those who are suffering from a mental illness. But on the 29th of February this year, Bill C-62, they name them there, received royal assent, which postponed that eligibility until March the 17th, 2027. The point I'm making is that lawmakers can change the law. That is what we are here for. So the slippery slope argument is often made, but actually the slippery slope would have to be engendered by politicians and by this Parliament.
That's a very helpful contribution. And I thank him. I think I want to crack on so that both the government and the movers of the debate can have their chance. We have heard concerns about vulnerable adults nearing the end of their life that could be at risk of pressure from family members who feel incapable, for whatever reason, of providing care and support for a terminally ill person. And, or worse, as eloquently touched on by the Honourable Member for Knowsley, those with even worse motives. It is essential that if reform is offered, that there is a plan for robust and effective safeguards against these issues. Matthew Parris's article has been referenced by members for South West Bedfordshire and East Ham. But unlike the honourable members for North Antrim and New Forest West, I believe Matthew Parris's article is not a reason for doing nothing. I've got my negatives right. Change must be backed by evidence and safeguards must be backed by evidence that work, so that we must look and learn from the international experiences and how reform has played out in other jurisdictions that have implemented such a law change. I do want to address palliative care and hospices, an issue I had hoped to speak about in the Chamber last week, as I recently visited the Shooting Star Hospice that is used by my constituents. We know we need to improve palliative care in this country. And again, the chair of the committee said that a law change in other jurisdictions has led to significant improvements in palliative care in those countries. My honourable friend from York Central addressed the issues of loneliness, poor social care. It's so essential that everyone, whatever their choices, has a good end-of-life experience. Irrespective of what happens on the law of assisted dying and what choice they take, we must improve end-of-life care in this country. And I was moved by the member for South West Bedfordshire, who described the difficulty in getting adequate morphine for his mother-in-law as she was nearing her end. But as the former Secretary of State for Health, the member for Suffolk West, said, even the best palliative care cannot remove the trauma and terrible pain of some health conditions. The issue of choice has been mentioned many times by members. The member for North West Hampshire said, and I slightly paraphrase, please don't impose the choices of others upon me. The member for Brighton Pavilion and others have addressed the issue that going to Dignitas is expensive, out of reach of many, and going means you aren't able to have your close family with you because if they were, they risk police investigation, and as Esther Ranson mentioned this morning on the radio. The member for Kingswood said that in Oregon, a third of those who initially choose the option of assisted dying don't actually take that route. Again, they had the choice at the end. The member, I think the issue about choice was described most profoundly when the member for Great Grimsby read out the letter to her from her and described what her friend had said to her in her last painful weeks. And that really came home to me very, very movingly. We've had other considered and thoughtful contributions from a number of other members, which I don't have time to list, but I thank them and I listened carefully. To conclude, Mrs. Latham, only by reforming the law and introducing safeguards to address the concerns that honourable members have raised today can we move the law forward, a law that is about personal freedom and morality. As the Supreme Court has decided, only Parliament can make the change. I want to restate the clear commitment that a future Labour government would make time for a private member's bill and a free vote so that Parliament can have the final say. A final say through a parliamentary vote following a full debate and a process of amendments. This place is at its best when it rises to the occasion and approaches issues on a cross-party, consensual and evidence-based approach. This is the approach that we need on this vital issue.
Mr. Laura Farris.
Thank you, Ms Latham. And I thank the Honourable Member for Gower for opening the debate, the Petitions Committee and the 200,000 people who signed the petition. And I pay particular tribute to Hannah Geiser and to Dame Esther Ransom for the way that she has articulated her own very moving case. It has been a privilege to listen to this debate. And I will say at the outset that it calls into conflict two fundamental values: the right to individual autonomy and the sanctity of life. And it was genuinely a privilege to hear voices on both sides of the debate, even when the disagreement was profound, and acknowledging the moral difficulties and challenges that we as parliamentarians face with this. Before turning to individual questions, I want to set out the government's position. Our view remains that any relaxation of the law is an issue of conscience for individual parliamentarians rather than one for government policy. And in the tradition of all conscience matters, where the government maintains a neutral stance, that is typically achieved through a private member's bill. As others have observed, the last occasion when the House of Commons debated legislative proposals was in September 2015. Then, just under 9 years ago, the Assisted Dying No. 2 bill was rejected at second reading, as the member for Suffolk Coastal pointed out, by 330 votes to 118. But this is not an area where opinion is static, nor is the composition of Parliament a static thing. It was because of the growing strength of feeling on this issue that the last debate on this subject took place less than 2 years ago in this hall on the 4th of July 2022, and I recall it because I was there. And it also resulted from an e-petition calling for a change in the law that also attracted many signatures. I will, of course.
Thank you for allowing me. The subject matter that we're dealing with today, she absolutely eloquently summarised the difficulties on both sides of the aisle here. But it's also been expressed today that there perhaps isn't the sense of faith that a private member's bill would do justice to the detail that we've been discussing in detail here today. How we get about this, I don't know. But I'm of the mind, and I didn't come here thinking this, it now needs to be done in government time, so it can go through the full committee process, so we can do our job, which we've illustrated we can do here today. But tucking it on to the private member's bill, I don't think will be the process that we should be pursuing.
May I say, I think I could not disagree for a moment that this is a subject that would require extensive time before the House. Everybody knows we are now in the months leading up to a general election. There is significant government legislation already planned, but with those caveats in mind, I hope I can address more about the substance of the debate, which is what this is really about. And I should add, if it becomes the clearly expressed will of Parliament to amend or change the criminal law to enable some form of assisted dying, then of course, as the Prime Minister has made clear, the government will ensure that the legislation is delivered in a way that is legally effective. But it is within the context of the government's neutral position that I wanted to set out and summarise the contours of this debate. And I wanted to pay tribute. I could pay tribute to so many speakers, so you'll forgive me, I hope, if I winnow it down to a few, but I wanted to start with a member for Sheffield Central, where he talked about his father, and then he talked about constituents, and similar points were made by the member for Stroud, who's no longer in his place. They talked about people with terminal diagnoses making the decision to take their own lives in circumstances that were premature, because they anticipated reaching a point where they would no longer be able to do that. The member for Suffolk West, the former Health Secretary, said that when he looked at the data, people with terminal diagnoses were 2 times more likely to commit suicide. And the point was made powerfully by the member for North West Hampshire that we can't disregard the fact that there is another route which those with means, that the same point was made by the member for Halton, Price and Howden, that those with means already take, that when they're at an early stage and when they have the resources, they can go to the Dignitas clinic. The member for North West Hampshire called it business class, and we can't ignore that. It's also true to say, as many have observed, that the view of the profession has shifted, or it may be shifting, with the BMA moving from a position of opposition to one of neutrality. Michael Burke did a programme on Radio 4, Moral Maze, on assisted dying, where he said that he'd recently chaired a series of medical conferences where doctors tried to reach an agreed position on assisted dying. And the majority of doctors there said that they hadn't gone into the profession to kill people, but at the same time they thought that they might choose assisted dying for themselves, and the moral ambiguity was not lost on them. Yes, I will.
Giving way. It's very kind of her. Having been diagnosed with bowel cancer myself last year, doctors already do give you an option. They give you an option as to whether to have the operation or not, which is why I asked, will I die if I don't have this operation? And he said yes. And I said, well, I want to live, so let's get on with it. They give you that option already. And then when you move into chemotherapy, they also give you the option as to whether you have it or not. So why not have that last control, that if you are in fact terminal, to have that option as to whether to die or not? Thank you.
Well, may I say, I didn't actually know that the Honourable Lady had that diagnosis, and I'm so sorry to hear that. And I will continue, if I may, sorry, to address her. To address you instead. Just to repeat the point that the medical profession, I was saying that they both said they didn't wish to be tasked with doing so, but they thought they might also want assisted dying for themselves. And the point was that they recognised that that was a morally inconsistent position to take, but it was also the one that was echoed by the member for Ealing Central and Acton, and we have to recognise that that tension exists in the medical profession. There were also counter-arguments that were elegantly expressed by the member for Aberconwy, for Devizes, for Suffolk Coastal, Don Valley, North Antrim, Congleton, to name a few. But let me set out one or two of them. One of them more or less echoed the decision that was reached by the Divisional Court in the Noel Conway case in 2017, and they said that Section 2 of the 1961 Suicide Act served to reinforce a moral view about the sanctity of life and to promote relations of full trust and confidence between doctors and their patients. And that position was echoed by the member for East Ham and also the member for Strangford. As parliamentarians, we cannot duck the difficult issues that this question engages. There's been a bit of focus on the law in Canada. Yes, I will, of course, yes.
I'm grateful to Mr. for giving way. She talked about the medical profession. She's talked about the various arguments for and against. But she is a distinguished member of the legal profession. And one of the things that many families or many people suffering with terminal diseases find so confusing is that the current law, as it stands, is inconsistent and is a mess. So we have a situation where it is technically illegal to accompany somebody to Switzerland, but when you return, the Crown Prosecution Service has a policy of not prosecuting. We have a situation, for example, where Mavis Eccleston, who agreed a suicide pact with her elderly husband, she survived, but was then prosecuted in court, effectively for murder, but acquitted, having gone through this dreadful experience. The current law is a mess, and I wondered if we could have her professional view on that.
Very good. Sitting minutes for one division, or 25 if we have two. So 15 minutes if we said 14 minutes past 7. If you could all return, please, to finish. Minister, would you like to resume?
Thank you very much, Chair. I would think I was responding to the member for North West Hampshire about consistency in the law, and yes, I do agree that that's a good thing. But I did want to touch on 4 arguments that were made by members who held an opposing view. The example was given of Canada, whether the law had changed, and the chair of the Select Committee made the point that no change had been implemented. But it is true to say that in 2016, when the Canadian legislation was introduced, the threshold was whether the individual suffered from a grievous and irremediable medical condition where death was reasonably foreseeable. What has been delayed but nonetheless agreed is to remove the requirement that death is foreseeable. And finally, they are also mulling whether the Act should apply to circumstances where there is no physical disease at all, in other words, where the condition is mental.
Will you allow me?
There is, I think I haven't got very much time, so I'm going to crack on. I'm sorry. Well, I'm told I don't. Anyway, the other issue is the evolution issue, the wider issue of principle. If a right to die should evolve, perhaps slowly and imperceptibly at first, but into a duty to die. The member for Aberconwy put it beautifully. Once we've allowed people to rationalise the quality of their life, how do we avoid it from becoming incumbent upon them to do so? And then there are also the hard cases. While some of the cases that were described in the chamber today are heart-rending and they sound clear-cut, we can't ignore the difficult ones. One in particular jumped out at me in relation to something the member for Gower said. This was the case in Belgium of Natalie Huygens, who ended her life because of the extreme psychological suffering she experienced after she was raped. And the member for Gower, and I mean this very respectfully, said we should give people the choice to take yourself out of suffering. But this is exactly what she would have argued she was doing, and we can't ignore these difficult cases. And then... Oh, well, yes, of course.
I'm very grateful to her, and I appreciate the point she's making. However, around the world, different countries have legislation to deal with abortion. And there are different time limits and different attitudes to it. So, for example, in Canada, it is technically legal to have an abortion up to the point of birth. The fact that other countries have different rules, or indeed have different cultural nuances around this or any other issue, doesn't mean, surely, that we shouldn't have and design our own framework for the same purpose.
I accept, of course, look, I'm not really presenting any particular argument. I'm reflecting the arguments that were made. I accept that we would not be in any legislative straitjacket, but these were the concerns that were raised by members, and they deserve ventilation in my summing up. And the final issue was that of manipulation, coercion. The member for North Antrim made the point very powerfully, and I was listening carefully to what the member for Knowsley and North West Hampshire said. Both of them said a majority of people are well-meaning, they love their relatives, but implicit in that is that a minority don't and are in dysfunctional families and may not have loved ones, and we must consider the consequences or the potential risks for them too. And then the member for the New Forest East, and I think for York Central too, talked about the subtle coercion that a person might experience from the sense of guilt at the cost that the illness is imposing on family members, and not just in terms of money, but in terms of stress and time and feeling that they could be becoming a burden. So it is right, it is necessary, it is incumbent upon us as parliamentarians to contemplate and recognise the enormity of the proposition, given the moral and ethical and medical issues that it engages. Just very briefly, I'm going to thank the Health and Social Care Select Committee for their excellent report. I'm going to confirm that one of the committee's recommendations is that the government considers how to respond to other jurisdictions in the UK and the Crown dependencies. And of course, should they move on this issue, we will work closely with them to consider the practical implications for England and Wales. A final point I wanted to make is, of course, end-of-life and palliative care of utmost importance. In the Health and Care Act 2022, the government added palliative care services to the list of services an integrated care board must commission. And in response to recommendation 5 from the Health and Social Care Committee's report, I think there was a request for a national strategy for death literacy. In our response that was published today, I don't think we went that far, but I want to reassure them that including palliative and end-of-life care in wider strategies is a commitment the government's made in response to that. So to conclude, I just want to thank everyone who has spoken and assure the House that the Government will reflect carefully on everything that's been said today. And in the meantime, I thank all honourable members for their sincere and heartfelt contributions to this debate.
Tony Antoni, to wind up, please.
Thank you, Mrs Latham, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Minister, who has rightly set out a measured response to the petition. And obviously the reality of committing to a debate on the floor of the House is difficult for her because we know that there's an impending general election and much business to do. So I hope that an incoming Labour government will have that opportunity. But Mrs Latham, I'd like to also thank the petitioners, the petition creator, Hannah, and Dame Esther Anson, because what today has shown us is our ability to come to this place with a range of different views strongly held and to have the debate in an informed manner. And also, I would like to thank the Honourable Member for Strangford, who has sent me a note for a balanced tone on the introduction to this debate on assisted suicide. But I'd like to thank him also, Mrs Latham, because that means the world. Haven't we done a really sterling job in this House today? And that is what we are here for, and that's why we are voted in. And I feel really strongly about it, as I have said before, because the Honourable Member for Aberconwy has talked about the voiceless and the people that don't have a voice in this debate. And I'm very good friends with the Paralympian, Baroness Tanny Gay-Thompson and Baroness Laura Finlay, who hold different views on this and are well informed and well spoken and have been in the media about this. But that doesn't mean we cannot give this House, this potential legislation, the sunlight that it deserves. And I think it is incumbent on us to do so. And we do so from a place of privilege because we are elected to this House. So on that note, I'd like to thank everybody, thank the petitioners and the campaigners, and you, Mrs Latham, for chairing this debate today. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered e-petition 653593 related to assisted dying. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. And of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.